The evening air was cold, and the streets were busy with people hurrying to finish their day. Cars moved slowly through traffic, their headlights reflecting on the wet road. Bright lights from shops and restaurants made the city feel alive, but for some people the night felt long and heavy. Near the entrance of a large restaurant, an old man sat quietly on a wooden bench beside the sidewalk. Most people passed by him without noticing. A few glanced at him for a second and then quickly looked away. His coat was old and worn. The sleeves were slightly torn, and the color had faded from years of use. His shoes had clearly walked many miles. They were cracked and dusty, and the soles were thin. The man sat with his hands folded together, trying to keep them warm. His fingers trembled slightly from the cold. His face showed deep lines that told the story of many difficult years. His beard was gray and uneven, and his eyes looked tired but calm. For the last 2 days he had eaten very little. Hunger was something he had learned to live with, but that evening it felt stronger than usual. His stomach tightened again and again, reminding him that he needed food soon. He looked up at the restaurant entrance. Warm light spilled through the glass doors each time someone walked in or out. Inside, people were laughing, talking, and enjoying dinner together. The smell of fresh bread and warm food drifted outside whenever the door opened. For a moment he closed his eyes and took a slow breath. He was not the kind of man who liked asking for help. For most of his life, he had taken pride in standing on his own feet. There had been a time when people respected him. There had been a time when he lived in a warm home, wore clean clothes every day, and had a purpose that filled his heart with pride. But life had changed in ways he never expected. Years had passed since those days. Hard moments had slowly taken pieces of the life he once knew. Work disappeared. Family moved away or faded from his world. One challenge after another pushed him further down a road he never planned to walk. Still, he never completely lost one thing: music. Even during the hardest nights, when the world felt quiet and lonely, music stayed in his memory like a warm light that refused to fade. He slowly opened his eyes again and looked through the restaurant window. Inside the room stood a beautiful piano near the wall. It was large and polished, the dark wood shining under the lights. The piano looked expensive and well cared for. He stared at it for a long moment. A memory passed through his mind like a gentle breeze. The feeling of smooth keys under his fingers. The sound of a melody filling a room. The quiet attention of people listening. His fingers moved slightly as if they could still feel the shape of the keys. But he quickly lowered his hands again. It had been many years. The city noise continued around him. People kept walking by. Some were talking on their phones. Some were laughing with friends. Some were simply rushing home after a long day. No one stopped. No one asked if he needed anything. He understood that. People were busy with their own lives. A man sitting quietly on a bench was easy to ignore. A few minutes passed. The cold wind brushed across the street again, making him pull his coat tighter around his body. His stomach tightened once more. Finally, he looked toward the restaurant door again. A small thought began forming in his mind. At first it felt impossible, almost foolish, but the thought stayed. Slowly he stood up from the bench. His legs felt stiff from sitting too long. He steadied himself for a moment before taking a step toward the entrance. Each step felt heavier than the last. He knew people might stare. Some might laugh. Others might tell him to leave. Still, the hunger pushed him forward. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment. Through the glass he could see families sitting together, couples enjoying quiet conversations, and waiters moving quickly between tables. Soft music played from speakers above, but the piano in the corner remained silent. He gently pushed the door open. Warm air wrapped around him immediately, carrying the smell of soup, roasted meat, and fresh bread. For a moment it almost felt overwhelming after the cold outside. A few people near the entrance noticed him right away. Their conversations paused. Some looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. His coat and worn shoes stood out clearly in the elegant room. A waiter walking past slowed down and looked at him with confusion. The old man remained calm. He did not raise his voice or make any sudden movements. He simply looked around the room with quiet respect. Near the center of the restaurant stood a man who appeared to be the manager. He wore a clean suit and was speaking with a group of guests. When he noticed the old man standing near the entrance, his expression changed slightly. He walked over with careful steps. "Sir," the manager said politely but firmly, "can I help you?" For a brief moment, the old man hesitated. Asking for help was never easy, but he kept his voice calm and respectful. "I'm sorry to disturb anyone," he said softly. "I was wondering if I could perform for a meal." The words were simple, but the moment they left his mouth, the nearby tables grew quiet. A few people turned in their chairs to look at him. Someone at the back of the room let out a small laugh. "Perform?" One man whispered to his friend with a smirk. Another guest leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, clearly curious about what was happening. The manager looked surprised. "Perform?" he repeated. The old man gently nodded and glanced toward the piano. "I can play," he said. For a moment, the manager did not know what to say. The room was not a place for random performances. The piano usually remained untouched unless a scheduled musician arrived for special evenings. Before the manager could respond, one of the guests at a nearby table spoke loudly enough for others to hear. "Well, this should be interesting," the man said with a chuckle. A few people laughed quietly. Someone else pulled out a phone, already preparing to record what they expected would be an awkward moment. The old man heard the laughter, but he did not react. His face remained calm. Years of hardship had taught him something important. People often judge what they do not understand. The manager looked around the room. Several guests were now watching closely. He sighed quietly. "Just a few minutes," he finally said. "And please be respectful of the guests." The old man nodded with gratitude. "Thank you," he said. He slowly walked toward the piano in the corner. Some people leaned forward with curiosity. Others exchanged amused looks as if expecting a strange show. The old man stopped beside the piano bench. For a moment he simply stood there. The polished surface of the instrument reflected the warm lights above. The keys were clean and smooth, perfectly lined in black and white. He gently placed his hand on the edge of the piano. A quiet feeling passed through him, something deep and familiar. It felt like meeting an old friend after many years apart. The room remained filled with whispers and small laughs, but the old man seemed to hear something else entirely. Memories, concert halls filled with people, long hours of practice, music flowing through his hands like a story waiting to be told. He slowly sat down on the bench. The room continued watching, some curious, some doubtful, some simply amused. He lifted his hands slightly above the keys. For a brief moment, his fingers hovered in the air. Then he closed his eyes and took one slow breath. The entire restaurant waited to see what would happen next. For a few seconds, the old man did not move. His hands hovered quietly above the piano keys, and his eyes remained closed. The restaurant was filled with soft whispers and quiet laughter from different tables. Many people were watching him now, but not with respect. Most of them expected something awkward or embarrassing. One man near the middle of the room leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "This should be good," he said quietly to the people at his table. A couple beside him smiled as if they were about to watch a strange kind of entertainment. Near the entrance, a waiter stood with a tray in his hands, pausing to see what would happen. Another worker near the counter shook his head slightly and muttered something under his breath. The old man slowly opened his eyes. For a brief moment he looked at the piano keys in front of him. The white and black lines felt familiar even after all these years. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from fear. It was more like the feeling someone gets when they are about to step into a memory that has been waiting for them for a long time. A voice from the back of the restaurant spoke again. "Does he even know how to play?" A few people chuckled quietly. Another guest raised a phone higher to get a clear video. Someone whispered, "This will probably go viral." The manager stood nearby with his hands folded, watching carefully. He was still unsure if allowing this had been a good idea. But now the moment had already begun, and everyone in the room seemed curious to see how it would end. The old man heard the laughter, but his face remained calm. He gently placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment nothing happened. Then he pressed one key. The sound was soft, almost delicate, but it carried clearly across the room. Some people continued their conversations, not paying much attention. Others waited, expecting the next note to sound clumsy or uncertain. Instead, another note followed. Then another. The first few sounds were slow and careful, like someone waking up from a deep sleep. The melody was quiet, but there was something about the way the notes connected that felt natural. A woman sitting near the piano turned slightly in her chair. "That doesn't sound bad," she whispered. At another table, a man who had been smiling earlier raised his eyebrows. The old man continued playing. His fingers moved gently at first, pressing each key with patience. The melody began to grow slowly, like a small stream of water that starts quietly before finding its rhythm. The room was still not completely silent, but the laughter had already begun to fade. The old man leaned forward slightly as he played. His hands moved a little faster now. The notes flowed together more smoothly, forming a melody that felt deep and emotional. It was not just random music. It sounded thoughtful, almost like a story being told without words. A couple sitting near the window stopped their conversation. They looked toward the piano. Another waiter who had been walking past suddenly slowed his steps. The music continued building. Each note seemed to fall exactly where it belonged. The man recording with his phone slowly lowered it for a second, surprised by what he was hearing. "That's actually good," he whispered. The old man's hands moved across the keys with more confidence now. His fingers no longer trembled. They moved with quiet control, pressing the keys with gentle precision. His shoulders relaxed as if the music was slowly carrying him somewhere far away from the restaurant. Inside his mind, memories began to return. He remembered the feeling of sitting in front of a piano many years ago. Long hours of practice. The sound of music filling a large hall. The quiet respect of people listening. For a moment, the cold streets and the difficult nights disappeared. Only the music remained. Back in the restaurant, more people were beginning to notice. The conversations around the room started fading one by one. Forks paused above plates. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. The melody grew stronger. It was still soft, but now it carried a depth that pulled people in. The notes rose and fell like waves, gentle but powerful. The man who had laughed earlier leaned forward slowly. "Wait a second," he said quietly. The people at his table looked toward the piano again. The music was becoming more complex now. The old man's hands moved across different parts of the keyboard, blending higher and lower notes together in a way that sounded rich and full. It no longer sounded like someone casually pressing keys. It sounded like someone who truly understood the instrument. A young woman sitting near the center of the room slowly placed her fork down on the table. Her eyes stayed fixed on the old man's hands. "How is he doing that?" she whispered. Another guest near the door looked toward the manager with a surprised expression. "Did you know he could play like that?" The manager shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. Near the back of the restaurant, one of the cooks had stepped out of the kitchen to see what was happening. He leaned against the doorway, listening carefully. The room was growing quieter with each passing moment. The old man continued playing as if he had forgotten where he was. His fingers now moved smoothly across the keys, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. The melody shifted gently between moments of sadness and moments of hope. Some people felt a strange emotion rising in their chest as they listened. It was the kind of music that made people stop and think. The man who had been recording earlier raised his phone again, but this time his face looked serious instead of amused. "This guy isn't joking," he said softly. At another table, an older couple exchanged glances. The woman leaned closer to her partner and whispered, "He plays like someone who has done this his whole life." The partner nodded slowly. The old man's head tilted slightly toward the keys as he played. His expression was peaceful, almost like he was speaking through the music instead of words. Every note felt intentional. Every pause felt meaningful. The piano, which had been silent for so long in the corner of the restaurant, now filled the entire room with sound. People who had been laughing earlier now sat quietly in their chairs. Some watched with curiosity. Others watched with growing respect. The manager slowly took a step closer to the piano, his eyes fixed on the old man's hands. He had seen professional musicians perform before during special events. This felt very similar, maybe even better. The melody continued building. Now the old man's hands moved faster across the keyboard, creating a richer and more powerful sound. The music flowed through the room like a wave of emotion. A waiter who had been standing near the wall whispered quietly, "I didn't expect this at all." No one laughed now. No one whispered jokes. Instead, the restaurant had become almost completely silent. Even the kitchen noise seemed softer as the workers listened from the doorway. The old man played on, unaware of the change happening around him. For him, the music was not about proving anything. It was simply something that had lived inside him for many years. And now, after a long time of silence, it was finally speaking again. As the melody continued growing deeper and more powerful, people in the restaurant began to realize something surprising. The homeless man they had laughed at only minutes ago was not an amateur. He was something else entirely, something they had never expected. And the music had only just begun. The restaurant had slowly fallen into a deep silence. Only the sound of the piano moved through the room now. The melody floated gently between the tables, reaching every corner of the restaurant. The old man sat calmly at the piano, his shoulders relaxed, his back straight. His fingers moved across the keys with a natural rhythm, as if they had never stopped playing all these years. Just minutes ago, people had been whispering and laughing. Now no one wanted to interrupt the music. A waiter near the wall slowly placed the tray. He was holding onto a nearby table without making a sound. He leaned slightly forward, listening carefully. At another table, a man who had earlier made a joke about the old man now looked completely different. His smile had disappeared. His eyes stayed fixed on the piano, following every movement of the musician's hands. The melody grew deeper. The notes were no longer just soft and careful. They carried emotion now. Some parts of the music sounded warm and hopeful. Other parts carried a quiet sadness that made people pause and think. The old man's hands moved faster across the keys, but every note was clear. Nothing sounded rushed or messy. It was controlled and graceful. Near the entrance, the manager slowly folded his arms, studying the performance with growing respect. He had allowed the man to play only for a few minutes, expecting the moment to end quickly. But now he found himself standing there, completely drawn into the music. The room felt different now. People were no longer watching the old man as a stranger. They were watching him as a musician. At a table near the window, a young woman leaned closer to the piano, resting her chin on her hand. "He plays like someone who belongs on a stage," she whispered quietly. Her friend nodded slowly. "Not like someone asking for a meal." Across the room, the man who had been recording with his phone earlier lowered it again. This time he wasn't trying to capture something funny. His expression showed genuine surprise. "I've seen professional concerts," he murmured to the person beside him. "This sounds just as good." The music continued building. The old man's fingers danced across the keys now. Sometimes they moved gently, creating soft and peaceful notes. Then suddenly they would move faster, bringing energy and life into the melody. The piano responded beautifully to every touch. The rich sound filled the restaurant like warm light spreading across a dark room. Inside the old man's mind, memories continued to rise. He remembered sitting in front of a piano many years ago, long before the cold nights and empty streets. He remembered the sound of applause in large halls. He remembered the quiet focus that came every time he placed his hands on the keys. Back then, music had been his life. He had spent endless hours practicing, learning every detail of the instrument. Every note had meaning. Every melody had a story. Even when life became difficult and the world around him changed, that part of him never completely disappeared. The music had always stayed somewhere inside. And now, sitting in this restaurant with people watching in silence, it had finally found its way back out. The melody shifted again. This time it became softer, almost like a quiet conversation. The old man's hands slowed down, pressing each key gently. The sound carried a feeling of reflection, as if the music was remembering something important. At a table near the center of the room, an older couple looked at each other with thoughtful expressions. "This feels emotional," the woman whispered. Her partner nodded slowly. "It's the kind of music that tells a story." The restaurant staff had almost completely stopped working now. A cook stood in the doorway of the kitchen with his arms crossed, listening carefully. Another worker leaned against the counter, staring at the piano with wide eyes. No one had expected this kind of moment during a normal evening. Even the soft background noise of plates and glasses had faded. The entire room had become an audience. The old man leaned slightly closer to the piano. His fingers began moving faster again, this time with greater energy. The melody grew stronger, rising higher and filling the air with power. Some guests felt a small chill run through them as they listened. The music carried something real. It carried years of experience, emotion, and discipline. It was clear now that the man playing the piano was not simply someone who knew a few songs. He was someone who understood the instrument deeply. A young man sitting near the back of the room leaned forward in his chair. "How is someone like him out on the streets?" he whispered quietly. No one at his table had an answer. The manager slowly walked a few steps closer to the piano. He studied the musician carefully. The worn coat, the tired face, the hands that looked rough from years of hardship. And yet those same hands moved across the piano with incredible skill. The contrast felt almost impossible to understand. The music rose again, becoming brighter and more energetic. Now the old man's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, jumping between notes with confidence. The melody sounded joyful for a moment, almost playful. A few guests exchanged surprised smiles. It felt like the music was showing many sides of life all at once. Sadness, hope, struggle, strength. Every person listening seemed to connect with it in their own way. Near the window, the young woman who had been watching earlier felt her eyes grow slightly wet. "I don't even know why," she said softly to her friend, "but this music makes me feel something." Her friend nodded quietly. "That's what real music does." The old man continued playing, completely focused on the keys. His breathing was slow and steady. His body moved slightly with the rhythm of the melody. He seemed calm, almost peaceful, as if nothing else in the world existed at that moment. For him, the restaurant had disappeared. There were no whispers, no curious eyes, no phones recording. There was only the piano and the music flowing through it. The melody began building towards something bigger now. The notes grew stronger, louder, more powerful. The old man's hands moved faster than before, crossing over each other with smooth precision. The sound filled the room like a rising wave. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Some held their breath without realizing it. Everyone could feel that the music was reaching an important moment. The final part of the melody was coming. The old man pressed the keys with confident strength, guiding the music toward its peak. The piano responded with a rich and powerful sound that echoed across the restaurant. For a brief moment, it felt like time had slowed down. Every ear in the room was listening. Every pair of eyes was watching. The old man's fingers moved quickly across the last section of the melody, bringing together all the emotion and energy that had built throughout the performance. Then, slowly, the music began to soften again. The powerful notes faded into something gentle and peaceful. His hands slowed. The melody floated quietly through the air like a final breath. The last note echoed softly through the restaurant. Then everything became completely silent. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The room stayed frozen in quiet amazement, as if people needed a second to understand what they had just experienced. The old man lifted his hands from the keys. He sat still on the bench, breathing calmly. And the entire restaurant stared at him, realizing that the man they had once laughed at had just given them a performance they would never forget. For a moment after the last note faded away, the restaurant stayed completely silent. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that happens when people experience something they did not expect and need a few seconds to understand it. The old man sat quietly at the piano bench. His hands rested gently on his lap now. His breathing was calm, but inside he could feel the quiet rush that always came after playing music. He slowly opened his eyes. The room in front of him looked very different from the moment he had walked in. Earlier, people had been whispering, laughing, and watching him with doubt. Now every face around the room looked serious, surprised, and thoughtful. A waiter standing near the wall blinked a few times as if he had just woken from a dream. At the table near the center of the room, the man who had joked earlier slowly lowered his head, almost embarrassed. Then suddenly someone near the back of the restaurant began clapping. The sound echoed through the quiet room. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant filled with applause. People stood up from their chairs. Some clapped loudly, while others shook their heads in disbelief. The sound of hands hitting together created a warm and powerful noise that filled the space where the music had just been. The old man looked around slowly, clearly surprised. He had expected people to ask him to stop after a few seconds. Instead, they were applauding him like he had just finished a concert. A woman near the window wiped her eyes gently while clapping. "That was beautiful," she whispered. The manager, who had been standing nearby during the performance, stepped forward slowly. His expression had completely changed. The earlier hesitation on his face was gone. Now he looked genuinely impressed. "That was incredible," he said honestly. The old man nodded politely. "Thank you," he replied softly. The applause slowly faded, but the attention in the room remained focused on him. People leaned toward each other, whispering in surprise. "Where did he learn to play like that? Did you hear the way he controlled the melody? He plays better than some musicians I've heard at concerts." Several guests looked at the piano again as if trying to understand what had just happened. The manager walked closer to the piano and placed one hand gently on the instrument. "I didn't expect that tonight," he admitted. The old man gave a small, humble smile. "I'm glad the music was welcome." One of the guests who had been recording with his phone stepped closer now. His expression no longer carried the amusement from earlier. "Sir," he said carefully, "have you played professionally before?" The question hung in the air. A few people nearby leaned forward, curious to hear the answer. The old man paused for a moment. His eyes moved toward the piano keys again. Memories passed quietly through his mind. "I played for many years," he said calmly. "Many years where?" the man asked. The old man leaned back slightly on the bench. "In many places," he replied simply. Some people exchanged curious looks. The answer sounded humble, but it also carried a quiet mystery. The manager folded his arms again, still studying the musician with interest. "You said you would perform for food," he said kindly. "But honestly, that performance was worth far more than a meal." The old man shook his head gently. "A warm meal would mean a lot tonight." The honesty in his voice made several people in the room feel a small wave of emotion. The manager nodded immediately. "You'll have a full dinner," he said. "Anything you want." A few guests clapped again at that moment, approving the gesture. But the curiosity in the room had only grown stronger. People wanted to know more about the man sitting at the piano. One older guest slowly stood up from his table and walked closer. "I've listened to piano music for many years," he said thoughtfully. "And the way you played, that wasn't ordinary." The old man listened quietly. "You played with experience," the guest continued. "The kind that takes decades to develop." The old man did not deny it. He simply nodded once. Across the room, the young woman who had been listening carefully spoke up. "If you don't mind me asking," she said gently, "why aren't you performing in concert halls anymore?" The question caused the room to grow quieter again. The old man looked down at his hands. His fingers were rough now, marked by years of work and life on the streets. But they still remembered the piano perfectly. Life had taken him down many unexpected roads. Some memories were difficult. Some stories were long. But he did not look angry or bitter. Instead, he looked calm, like someone who had learned to accept what life had given him. "Sometimes life changes direction," he said softly. The simple answer carried more meaning than many words. The people around him seemed to understand that. A waiter approached the piano carefully. "Your dinner will be ready soon," he said kindly. "Thank you," the old man replied. The waiter hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Would you play another piece while you wait?" The question surprised several people. But before the old man could answer, someone else spoke up. "Yes, please," a guest near the window said. Another voice joined. "We would love to hear more." Soon several people around the restaurant nodded in agreement. The old man looked around the room. Just minutes ago, the same people had expected him to fail. Now they were asking him to continue. He smiled slightly. "All right," he said. The room grew quiet again as he turned back toward the piano. He placed his hands above the keys once more. But before he began playing, the manager gently stepped closer. "I think everyone here would like to know something," he said respectfully. The old man looked up. "What is it?" he asked. The manager tilted his head slightly. "What is your name?" For a brief moment, the room waited. The old man looked around at the faces watching him. Then he gave a quiet answer. But the name itself meant nothing to most people in the room. Still, the way he spoke it carried dignity. One guest near the back frowned slightly, thinking. The name sounded familiar somehow, but he could not remember where he had heard it before. The old man then turned back toward the piano again. His fingers gently touched the keys. The room fell silent once more. And this time, everyone listened not because they expected a surprise, but because they already knew they were hearing something special. The room became quiet again as the old man turned back toward the piano. A few minutes earlier people had been laughing and whispering, but now every eye in the restaurant followed his hands. He gently placed his fingers on the keys once more. This time the atmosphere felt different. The audience was no longer waiting for a mistake. They were waiting for another beautiful moment. He pressed the first key softly. A slow melody began to rise again. The notes moved gently through the room like a calm breeze. People leaned back in their chairs and listened closely. Some even closed their eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over them. The piano seemed to respond to his touch as if it had been waiting for someone like him. The sound was rich and warm, filling every corner of the restaurant. While he played, a man sitting near the back of the room kept staring at him carefully. He looked thoughtful, almost puzzled. There was something about the way the old man played that felt very familiar. The man leaned closer to the table and whispered to the person sitting beside him. "I feel like I've heard this style before," he said quietly. The person beside him shrugged. "Maybe from a concert or a recording?" The man shook his head slowly. "No, it's more than that." He kept watching the old man's hands. The melody grew slightly stronger now. The old man's fingers moved with confidence and grace, jumping across the keyboard in smooth patterns. Every note sounded clear and intentional. The man at the back of the room leaned forward more. Suddenly a memory flashed through his mind. Years ago he had attended a classical music concert in a large hall in another city. The hall had been full that night, and the pianist on stage had received a long-standing ovation after performing a powerful piece. The music that night had carried the same emotional depth he was hearing now. The man looked again at the old musician sitting at the restaurant piano. His eyes widened slightly. "Wait," he whispered. The person beside him looked confused. "What?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up slowly from his chair. The movement caught the attention of a few nearby guests, but most people were still focused on the music. He walked a few steps closer to the piano, studying the old man carefully. The beard, the worn coat, the tired face. Those things made him look very different from the musician he remembered from years ago. But the hands looked the same. The same smooth movement across the keys. The same emotional style. The man felt a sudden rush of realization. When the melody finally reached its final notes and faded softly into silence, the room again paused for a brief second. Then the applause returned. It was even louder this time. People clapped with real admiration now. Some guests stood up again. The energy in the restaurant felt warm and excited. But the man who had stepped forward did not clap right away. Instead, he spoke. His voice carried clearly across the quiet room. "I know who you are." The words immediately caught everyone's attention. The old man looked up slowly. The manager, the waiters, and many guests turned toward the man who had spoken. "What do you mean?" someone asked. The man walked a few steps closer to the piano. His expression was serious but filled with amazement. "You used to perform in major concert halls," he said carefully. A quiet murmur spread across the restaurant. The old man said nothing. "You were known for your emotional performances," the man continued. "Your recordings were played on classical radio stations for years." Several people looked at each other with surprise. The manager frowned slightly, trying to understand. "You're saying he's a professional pianist?" he asked. The man nodded slowly. "Not just professional," he said. "He was famous." The word hung in the air. Famous. People around the room began whispering again. "That can't be true." "Are you serious? I've never heard of that." The man looked directly at the old musician again. "I attended one of your concerts many years ago," he said. "It was unforgettable." The old man lowered his eyes for a moment. It seemed he had hoped that part of his life would remain quiet. But the music had spoken for him. The manager looked stunned. "Is that true?" he asked gently. The old man took a slow breath. "Yes," he said quietly. The restaurant fell silent again. People stared at him with new understanding. Just an hour earlier they had seen a homeless man standing at the door asking if he could perform for food. Now they were hearing that he had once been a well-known musician. The man who had recognized him continued speaking softly. "You performed across the country," he said. "Your concerts were always full." A young woman near the window leaned forward in her chair. "What happened?" she asked carefully. The old man remained quiet for a moment. Then he looked down at his hands again. "Life happened," he said simply. The room listened closely. "There were difficult years," he continued calmly. "Work slowly disappeared. Personal struggles followed. One problem led to another." His voice remained steady, without bitterness. "Eventually I lost my home." No one interrupted him. The story was simple, but it carried a heavy truth. The manager shook his head slowly in disbelief. "It's hard to imagine someone with your talent ending up on the streets," he said. The old man gave a small, calm smile. "Talent doesn't always protect people from life." Those words made several guests lower their eyes. Many of them had judged him the moment he walked through the door. Now they realized how wrong that first impression had been. The man who had recognized him spoke again. "You may not realize it," he said, "but your music inspired many people." The old man looked surprised. "It did." The man nodded. "I remember that concert clearly even after all these years." The room grew warm with quiet emotion. One of the waiters stepped forward. "You deserve more than just a meal tonight," he said sincerely. Other guests began agreeing. "Yes, absolutely. You should be back on a stage." The old man listened quietly, clearly touched by their words. For the first time that evening, the restaurant no longer saw him as a homeless stranger. They saw him as a musician with a powerful story. And many people in the room began to realize something important. Sometimes the greatest talents are hidden behind the people the world forgets to notice. The restaurant remained quiet for several seconds after the truth came out. People looked at the old man in a completely different way now. Just an hour earlier, many of them had seen him as a stranger asking for food. Now they understood that he was someone who had once stood on stages, playing music for large audiences. The manager slowly pulled out a chair and sat down near the piano. He seemed deep in thought. "I still can't believe it," he said softly. "You were performing in concert halls? And tonight you walked in asking if you could play for a meal." The old man looked down at the piano keys for a moment. "Yes," he replied quietly. His voice carried no anger, no frustration. It sounded calm, like someone who had accepted the road life had given him. A few guests began returning to their seats, but their attention stayed on him. Some were whispering with curiosity. Others simply watched him with respect. The waiter soon returned with a large plate of warm food. Steam rose gently from it, filling the air with a comforting smell. There was fresh bread, vegetables, and a warm bowl of soup. He carefully placed the plate on a small table beside the piano. "Please enjoy," he said kindly. The old man looked at the food for a second. His eyes showed quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Several guests watched as he slowly began eating. He did not rush, but it was clear he had been very hungry. The restaurant had returned to its normal rhythm, but something about the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were quieter. People were thoughtful. Near the window, the young woman who had been listening earlier spoke softly to her friend. "It's strange," she said. "Someone with so much talent sitting alone on the streets." Her friend nodded slowly. "It reminds us that we don't really know anyone's story." Across the room, the man who had recognized the musician continued speaking with the manager. "You know," he said, "there are still many people who remember his music." The manager looked surprised. "Really?" "Yes. His recordings were played on radio stations for years. Many people admired his performances." The manager looked back at the old man thoughtfully. "Well," he said, "maybe tonight shouldn't just end with dinner." The man raised his eyebrows. "What are you thinking?" The manager leaned forward slightly. "I'm thinking that someone with talent like that shouldn't be forgotten." While they spoke, the old man finished his meal and wiped his hands gently with a napkin. He looked calmer now, the warmth of the food giving him new strength. The manager walked over again. "How was the meal?" he asked. "It was wonderful," the old man replied with a grateful smile. The manager nodded. "I'm glad." For a moment he hesitated, as if deciding how to say something. Then he spoke again. "Would you be willing to come back here tomorrow evening?" The old man looked surprised. "To play?" he asked. "Yes," the manager said. "Not for food this time." The nearby guests listened closely. "I would like you to perform here properly," the manager continued, "as our guest pianist." The old man stared at him for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You mean, as a musician?" he asked. "Exactly," the manager said with a smile. A few guests began clapping again when they heard this. "That's a great idea," someone said. Another guest added, "I would come back just to hear him play again." The old man felt something warm rise inside his chest. For a long time he had believed the world had forgotten his music. Now he realized that maybe the music had simply been waiting for the right moment to return. "I would be honored," he said quietly. The manager smiled. "Good." He then looked around the room. "Everyone here tonight witnessed something special," he said. "And tomorrow night we can share it again." The guests responded with cheerful applause. But the biggest change had already happened. The old man no longer looked like someone standing outside in the cold asking for help. He looked like someone who belonged beside the piano. Later that night, when the restaurant began closing, the manager walked with him to the door. The cold air waited outside again, but the night felt different now. Before the old man stepped out, the manager handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "Just a small thank you for tonight's performance," the manager replied. The old man opened it slightly and saw some money inside. He looked up with surprise. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I want to," the manager answered. "You gave everyone here something special tonight." The old man nodded slowly. "Thank you." He stepped outside and looked back through the restaurant window. Inside, the piano still stood quietly in the corner. But now it felt different. It was no longer just a memory from the past. It had become a new beginning. As he walked slowly down the street, he thought about everything that had happened that evening. A simple question asked with humility had changed everything. "Can I perform for food?" That small moment had reminded an entire room of people about something important. Talent can exist anywhere. Great stories can belong to anyone. And sometimes the person the world overlooks is the very person who has the most beautiful music to share. The next evening the restaurant would be full again. But this time the audience would not be waiting for a homeless man asking for a meal. They would be waiting for a pianist whose music had once again found its voice. And as the old man disappeared into the quiet street, one thing was certain. His story was not ending that night. In many ways, it was only beginning again.